New Mexico desert, 1945. The wind kicks up dust over the U.S. Army hangars. Among uniformed officers, a man in a dark suit emerges, lean, with eyes that mix calculation and fear. In his luggage, there are no weapons, just a briefcase of rocket blueprints and an indelible task. His name is Wernher von Braun, and that morning, he doesn't arrive as an ordinary prisoner. He arrives as the man who could redefine an entire nation's power. 3 months earlier, he commanded Peenemünde, the Nazi Germany's missile research center. Now he steps onto American soil under the code name Valuable Technical Resource. The officers eye him like they're appraising a rare machine, not a human being. "Can you rebuild the V2 for us?" the colonel asks. Von Braun replies without hesitation, "I can build something better." The war hasn't even cooled yet, but the next battlefield is already being mapped out, and it will be fought in Earth's orbit. During the interrogations, Wernher von Braun speaks with a professor's detachment and an engineer's precision. He explains the liquid propulsion system, the controlled gyroscopes, the trajectory calculations. His voice is calm, almost pedagogical. Every number he utters is a bridge thrown across the chasm between former enemies. The Americans realize this man isn't just a scientist, he's the key to a new military era. But there's weight in his documents. Wernher von Braun has been a member of the SS since 1940. He visited the underground factories at Mittelbau-Dora, where concentration camp prisoners worked to death assembling the V2s. More than 20,000 people died in those concrete caverns, more than the direct victims of the rockets launched over London. He saw the bodies, and yet he kept calculating. The ethical dilemma didn't last long. The U.S. government devised a plan with a bureaucratic name and a pragmatic soul, Operation Paperclip. Paperclips attached new files to old dossiers. Nazi affiliations were omitted. Crimes were reclassified as involuntary technical collaboration. It wasn't forgiveness, it was organized forgetting. The logic was simple. If the Soviets got to Hitler's engineers first, they'd win the next war without firing a shot. Von Braun accepted the deal with surgical serenity. The choice was survival and continuing to launch rockets. He and over 100 German engineers were taken to Fort Bliss, Texas, where they began rebuilding the V2s with captured parts. The first attempts were disastrous. Engines exploded, systems failed, every test ended in flames. But he didn't blame anyone. He analyzed, corrected, and started over. "The problem is in the liquid oxygen valve," he would say, pointing out the error like one points to a destiny. The Americans were fascinated. Von Braun didn't just know how to build rockets, he knew how to teach. He turned every failure into a lesson, every disaster into data. His technical leadership was almost hypnotic. In no time, the same men who had distrusted him now called him professor. While the world tried to heal the wounds of war, the German engineer dreamed of orbital stations, trips to the moon, expeditions to Mars. For him, the sky was a laboratory, and the rocket an instrument of redemption. In 1950, he was transferred to Huntsville, Alabama, where he took command of the Redstone Arsenal. There he began developing America's first ballistic missile. Every successful launch erased a little more of the SS Echo. Every technical triumph made him more indispensable. The metamorphosis from enemy to hero was underway. His public consecration began in 1952. Collier's magazine published a series of articles written by von Braun describing the future of space exploration. The illustrations showed rotating stations, lunar modules, interplanetary voyages. He wrote with didacticism and charisma. The American public, in the midst of the Cold War, saw in that stiff-accented German the symbol of technological optimism. 3 years later, Walt Disney knocked on his door. He invited him to present a series of educational programs about the world of tomorrow. Millions watched that elegant, serene man explain how we would reach the stars. The public loved him. Children admired him. No one asked about Mittelbau-Dora. No one remembered the SS. But in October 1957, a metallic sphere crossed the sky and shattered America's illusion of technological superiority. The Soviet Sputnik entered orbit. For the first time, space had an owner, and it wasn't the West. Von Braun watched the news in silence. "I warned you," he said simply. 2 weeks later, he gathered his team in Huntsville. "We can put a satellite in orbit in 90 days, he declared, if they'll let us try. The request was bold, and the response was slow. The U.S. Navy already had its own project, the Vanguard, and didn't want to hand the glory to an ex-Nazi. But failure came live on camera. The rocket rose 2 meters, fell, and exploded. The whole country watched, and for the first time, Wernher von Braun's name was seen not as a burden from the past, but as hope for the future. On January 31, 1958, the Juno 1 rocket launched. 17 minutes later, the Explorer 1 satellite was in orbit. America had its answer to Sputnik. That night, as the country celebrated, von Braun sat alone in his office. The phone rang nonstop. Journalists wanted statements. He just stared at the blackboard covered in formulas and scribbles. The rocket of forgetting had worked. Huntsville, Alabama, 1960. Dawn is metallic. The sound of engines echoes through the hills. At the Redstone Arsenal, engineers arrive before the sun. Among them, Wernher von Braun, now an American citizen, respected director, scientific hero. His German accent still colors his words, but the suit, the smile, and the new passport complete the metamorphosis. The former SS officer now leads America's technological heart, and no one wants to remember where he came from. The Redstone corridors smell of oil, coffee, and ambition. The walls are covered in rocket diagrams. The team works with military discipline and almost religious reverence. "He's a genius," the young engineers say. Von Braun observes every detail with mathematical precision. The smallest calculation error could mean an explosion, and, ironically, technical failure terrifies him more than the moral weight of his past. For him, success is redemption, and mathematics is the new form of prayer. But the shadow of Mittelbau-Dora still follows him. Sometimes in the silent early mornings, he dreams of the underground galleries, the air heavy with metal and blood. He dreams of the prisoners with empty stares, pushing parts under whips and shouts. He wakes up sweating, stares at the ceiling, and repeats the mantra that saves him. Science has no guilt. Science is neutral. And he tries to believe it. In public, he speaks of hope. In a lecture in Washington, he says, "Mankind was born on Earth, but it was not meant to stay there." The audience applauds. In the crowd, few know that the inspirer of space dreams began his career creating weapons that turned cities to ashes. The irony is monumental, but convenient. The past is an equation no one wants to solve. 1958 brought the birth of NASA. The U.S. government decided that if space would be the stage for the Cold War, it should also be a symbol of peace. Von Braun was transferred with his entire team to the newly created Marshall Space Flight Center. There, the dream gained a name: Saturn, a colossal rocket capable of taking man to the moon. For Americans, it was a political challenge. For von Braun, it was transcendence. The project demanded more than ingenuity. It demanded faith. No engine of that size had ever worked. No electrical system had been tested on such a scale. Every failure would be a national tragedy. But von Braun knew how to operate under pressure. He organized everything with barracks discipline and a conductor's obsession. Check, test, repeat. That was his religion. and the engineers followed him with devotion. While engines exploded in tests, he smiled. "The explosion is the most honest teacher," he would say, with a dry humor few understood. It took years of attempts. The first F-1 engines were untamable monsters. They vibrated, screamed, tore steel. Combustion instability made them explode without warning. Von Braun watched the footage frame by frame, studying every oscillation, every flame, until he found the solution: internal baffles that tamed the chaos. When the first F-1 completed a full test without failure, he raised his glass of champagne and said, "Physics doesn't forgive, but sometimes it grants mercy." The engineers laughed. No one noticed the metaphorical weight of the phrase. While the world saw progress, he saw redemption. But the press never fully forgets. A New York Times Magazine reporter asked about his Nazi past. Von Braun replied with calculated coolness, "My interest has always been technical, never political." The phrase made headlines, and once again it convinced. The public wanted heroes, not judgments. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy announced the impossible. "Before the end of this decade, we will land a man on the moon." In the auditorium, von Braun listened with shining eyes. That was the final call. The mission that would free him definitively from the shadow of his past. He would be the architect of humanity's greatest achievement. But within NASA itself, not everyone saw him as a visionary. George Mueller, director of manned flights, distrusted his centralizing leadership. "He wants to control everything, as if he's still in Peenemünde," he commented in a closed meeting. Others, however, acknowledged no one was as effective as he was. When he visited contractor factories, engineers stopped what they were doing. His presence commanded respect and fear. He demanded precision, but also inspired. He said, "The impossible is just a matter of calculation." At home, he was a reserved man. He played piano on quiet nights and read philosophy. He liked quoting Nietzsche, but never mentioned Hitler. To his wife, he once confessed, "I want to be remembered for what I launched into the sky, not for what fell upon the earth." In the labs, the Saturn V project grew like a cathedral, each section an altar to science, each bolt a prayer to progress. More than 20,000 American companies worked under his supervision. It was the greatest technological effort ever coordinated by one man, and yet von Braun kept it all under control. Science is exact, politics isn't. But time was running out. The Soviet Union was advancing fast. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. In 1965, Alexei Leonov made the first spacewalk. The pressure on Huntsville was brutal. The president wanted results. The world wanted the moon, and von Braun knew if he failed, the past would swallow him. In November 1967, the first complete version of the Saturn V was positioned at Cape Kennedy. The unmanned test, Apollo 4, would be humanity's dress rehearsal. Von Braun watched the countdown with hands clasped, as in prayer. 3, 2, 1. The roar of the engines shook the ground. The rocket rose slowly, with the majesty of a living mountain. 11 minutes later, it was in perfect orbit. The silence in the control room was broken by applause. Von Braun didn't celebrate. He just removed his glasses and said, "It worked." The tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed something deeper: relief, perhaps guilt. In the following years, he continued overseeing the Apollo program with the detachment of one carrying a nation's destiny. But deep down, he knew every scientific victory was also a moral escape. Cape Kennedy, 1969. The countdown echoes through the loudspeakers, mingling with the roar of test engines. In the control center, lights flicker like the electric synapses of a giant brain. Wernher Braun watches the monitors without blinking. Every number, every datum, is a reminder of the path that brought him here. From the dust of Peenemünde to Florida's hot asphalt. So many years to reach 11 minutes of truth, he murmurs. At 9:32 a.m., the clock hits zero. The Saturn V awakens with a roar that sounds like Earth's breath. The rocket ascends carrying 3 men and a promise. Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins are at the top of the masterpiece of an ex-Nazi who is now an American hero. The irony would be unbearable if it weren't so spectacular. Von Braun clenches his fists. 2 minutes and 41 seconds later, the first stage separates perfectly. The second takes over. At 9 minutes, the capsule enters orbit. Every system works like God's clockwork. He takes a deep breath. Now destiny is in the vacuum, he says, and finally leans back in his chair. For 3 days, the world holds its breath. Millions of televisions show grainy images of a small metallic dot crossing space. In factories, bars, and churches, people look up. For the first time, humanity seems united in a single miracle. At the Marshall Space Flight Center, engineers cheer with every update. But von Braun, in his isolated office, watches in silence. When the Eagle module lands and Armstrong's voice echoes, "The Eagle has landed," he closes his eyes. Silent tears. The rocket of redemption has completed its orbit. While the world celebrates, he remains motionless. There's a detail few notice. Von Braun isn't in Houston, beside the astronauts. He's in Huntsville, away from the cameras. Perhaps by choice, perhaps by politics, perhaps by guilt. He watches Armstrong descend the ladder and step on the moon. One small step for man. The phrase circles the planet and reaches his ear like an echo of penance. The engineer who calculated destruction now sees his machine serve history. But inside him, something whispers, no machine cleans the blood from the hands that designed it. The country erupts in euphoria. Parades, medals, speeches, magazine covers. Von Braun, the man of the moon, the savior of American prestige. No reporter mentions Mittelbau-Dora. No camera films the weary eyes that avoid the mirror. In interviews, he speaks with calm technicality, all systems performed within expected parameters. The public hears victory, but what he means is redemption. Soon plans for the future begin. Permanent lunar bases, Mars missions, Jupiter explorations. Von Braun describes it all with almost youthful enthusiasm. Maps, charts, models. The sky is just the next laboratory. But Washington has other priorities. The Vietnam War consumes the budget, and the space dream begins to lose steam. "The race is over," a senator says. "We won." Von Braun smiles, but inside he feels the weight of the word end. Gradually, the spotlights fade. America tires of rockets. He who took it to the moon now has to convince politicians to invest in the next frontier. "We're trapped in the orbit of mediocrity," he laments in a meeting. But no one listens anymore. The country wants problems solved on Earth. He, however, only feels alive looking up. In 1970, he's transferred to Washington, a more bureaucratic than inspiring role. Officially, it's a promotion. In practice, it's exile. Mornings of tests and smoke are traded for stacks of reports and meetings with congressmen who can't tell Newton from Einstein. Von Braun still talks about Mars, but he no longer believes he'll see that dream in his lifetime. The fate of visionaries is to be too far ahead of their time and pay for it, he comments to a colleague. 2 years later, he resigns from NASA, officially for health reasons. In truth, because there's no longer enough sky for what he wanted to build. He takes a job at a private company and travels the country giving lectures on the future of space exploration. He speaks of humanity, cooperation, faith in progress. Audiences give him standing ovations, but there's always someone who asks about Germany, the SS, Dora. In those moments, he takes a deep breath and replies, "Yes, I worked for the regime, but my loyalty has always been to the stars." The answer divides opinions. For some, it's an excuse. For others, a confession. But the public prefers the myth to judgment, and the myth keeps growing. At home, at night, he writes his memoirs. He talks about rockets, calculations, dreams, but there are too many blank pages. When his wife reads the manuscript, she asks, "Why don't you talk about the war?" He replies with a phrase that sums up his entire life. "Because the past is an orbit I don't want to complete. Over time, cancer consumes him. In 1977, the man who defied gravity dies at 65. His obituaries describe him as a space pioneer, engineering genius, father of the Saturn V. Only in discrete paragraphs does anyone mention what he was before. SS member, overseer of death factories. But the world prefers the hero. And so history marches on, as if the sky had absolved the earth. Today, his name is still on schools, research centers, and museums. The Marshall Space Flight Center carries his legacy. The Saturn V rocket is displayed as a relic of an era of courage and conquest. But for those who look closer, there's a shadow there. The reminder that progress doesn't always spring from virtue. And that's where the story becomes more than biography. It becomes a mirror. Von Braun is the reflection of the human dilemma. Can we use genius to build the future without losing ourselves along the way? Can we celebrate achievement without ignoring the cost? If you believe that stories like this, real, human, full of paradoxes, deserve to keep being told, subscribe now. This is the kind of narrative the world needs to remember. The thin line between brilliance and darkness, between hero and accomplice. Huntsville, Alabama, 1977. The American flag over Wernher von Braun's coffin flutters lightly, pushed by an indecisive wind. Scientists, politicians, and former NASA colleagues watch in silence. No one mentions the word Germany. No one speaks of SS. The priest recites verses about faith and redemption. The press writes obituaries exalting the genius who took man to the moon. The crowd believes it's burying a hero. But under that flag, the past still breathes. With von Braun's death, a chapter ends, but another, more uncomfortable one begins. Behind the scenes of the U.S. government, documents start to emerge. Operation Paperclip, the program that brought over 1,600 Nazi scientists to the United States, gains new attention. The public, distracted by new wars and crises, doesn't notice right away. But journalists and historians sniff out something bigger. The truth wasn't buried with the engineer. It just waited for the right moment. In 1980, Congress opens a formal investigation into the benefits and risks of Operation Paperclip. The report is scathing. It's discovered that names were erased, crimes reclassified, files manipulated. Von Braun, cited dozens of times, emerges as a symbol of America's moral dilemma. How much is ethics worth against technological advantage? The hearings are discreet, without the spectacle of major scandals. No one wants to destroy the myth of the man who took humanity to the moon. The truth is treated like radiation. Everyone knows it exists, but they avoid getting close. Meanwhile, new generations grow up learning the name von Braun in school textbooks and NASA field trips. Saturn V models, Apollo 11 videos, science books, all describe him as a visionary, pioneer, patriot. The past is edited, softened, narrated as a trajectory of overcoming. The scientist who began serving war now serves the collective imagination. Few mention that in the caverns of Mittelbau-Dora, progress was built on corpses. But time has a dangerous habit, reopening wounds. In 1985, American journalist Linda Hunt publishes a book revealing the true scale of Paperclip. Original documents, photographs, lists of names. The revelations are shocking. Von Braun, the face of the lunar conquest, signed reports confirming regular visits to slave factories. The press debates again. Was he complicit or a regime hostage? The public reacts with shock, but also resistance. He was a product of his time, some say. Without him, there might not have been a space race others justify. Dora's victims find no humor in it. Camp survivors give interviews decades later, describing the horror. We worked 18 hours a day, in the dark. 10-15 died per shift. And one day, he came. In a suit, clean, looking at everything calmly. He jotted notes in a notebook and left. These testimonies fall like grenades into American memory. It's impossible to ignore, but equally impossible to deconstruct the myth without deconstructing national pride. Years pass, and public judgment divides. Documentaries begin portraying the engineer with more ambiguity. He's shown both at NASA conferences and in the Reich's underground ruins. Von Braun's image now carries two flags, one star-spangled, the other stained. History becomes a mirror of humanity, brilliant and blemished at the same time. In the early 2000s, with the opening of CIA and Department of Defense archives, definitive proof emerges. Von Braun and his team were brought to the United States with full knowledge of their war crime ties. The internal justification, recorded in memos, is blunt. The Soviets would do the same. The phrase sums up an entire era and a philosophy of power that still echoes. Echoes that repeat. The same ethical dilemma that allowed von Braun's forgiveness appears in new technological frontiers. Autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence, biotechnology. Scientists continue advancing faster than morality can keep up. Technology is neutral. It just changes flags. Von Braun's phrase sounds prophetic again, almost ironic. In 2010, a temporary exhibition at the Holocaust Museum in Washington tries to rebalance the narrative's weight. The title, The Shadow of Dora. At the center, an enlarged photo shows von Braun inspecting a rocket beside SS officers. Beside it, the caption, "The man who took man to the moon also passed through here." Visitors leave in silence. It's impossible not to feel the discomfort, and perhaps that's the point. Historians agree on one thing: von Braun's life is the purest portrait of modern contradiction. He represents the triumph of intelligence and the failure of conscience. He was the man who looked to infinity and forgot what was under his feet. No biography can solve that equation, and perhaps it shouldn't. Today in Huntsville, the U.S. Space and Rocket Center proudly displays the Saturn V suspended above the floor. Children look up, awestruck by the machine's size. Near the exit, a small plaque mentions von Braun. Visionary, engineer, pioneer. Nothing more. No word about the other side. It's the museum's most eloquent silence. From time to time, someone proposes renaming the center, removing the honors, correcting history. Others defend keeping them as a lesson. Both sides are right, because perhaps the real mistake isn't remembering, but forgetting that every advance has a cost. Wernher von Braun's trajectory is ultimately a fable about power. Not about rockets, but about choices, about how humanity decides who can be redeemed and who is forgotten. His life teaches that progress can be made of light, but it always casts shadows behind. And that's why this story needs to be told, again and again, because it doesn't speak only of one man, but of a pattern. And every time science advances faster than morality can keep up, his name echoes once more. Huntsville, Alabama, 2025. The sun reflects off the metallic body of the Saturn V, displayed horizontally at the U.S. Space and Rocket Center. Families stroll, children point, tourists take photos. Above their heads, the rocket looks like a sleeping whale, a titan made of aluminum and steel. Near the entrance, a golden plaque bears Wernher von Braun's name. For many, it's just the name of a brilliant man. For others, it's a reminder that even humanity's greatest dreams can be born from nightmares. More than 40 years after his death, von Braun's figure still provokes discomfort. He remains present in books, universities, series about the space race. Movies portray him as a visionary. Documentaries expose him as an accomplice. His life is studied in engineering courses and ethics seminars. He is, at once, a source of inspiration and an object of repulsion. What time hasn't done is resolve the paradox. How can someone build bridges to infinity and at the same time have walked over bodies? In the modern era, von Braun's story resurfaces with new force. The world is living another space race, now private, corporate, still fueled by the same propellant, ambition. Companies compete to put the first human on Mars, rockets are back in fashion, and von Braun's name returns to debates. Elon Musk cites him as an influence. Jeff Bezos calls him an absolute genius. Historians reply, a genius who worked for murderers. The cycle repeats. Progress advances, but ethical questions continue floating in the air, like satellites without orbit. In 2020, an exhibition in Berlin gathers artifacts from Peenemünde, NASA, and Mittelbau-Dora. At the center, an unpublished photo, von Braun, smiling, beside SS officers and American engineers. 3 different flags, 3 worlds he inhabited, and none completely. The caption is simple. Between heaven and hell, he chose what let him keep rising. Visitors weep, others just watch, silent, because, deep down, his story is also about us, about the eternal temptation to justify any means in the name of a brilliant end. The debates intensify. Should we separate the man from the work? Is it possible to admire the Saturn V without absolving the engineer who designed it? Philosophers and scientists discuss. Some argue that morality must be judged in the context of the era. Others remind that even then he had a choice. The truth, perhaps, lies between the two. Von Braun was neither monster nor saint. He was human, and that's precisely why he was dangerous. Because humanity is capable of building wonders and justifying them even when they spring from horror. In the United States, NASA avoids revisiting the topic publicly. Its museums prefer exalting the lunar conquest, not the price paid to achieve it. It's understandable. The Apollo program is the greatest symbol of national pride, and questioning von Braun would be like questioning the American myth itself, that which believes talent and vision can erase any past. The narrative is seductive. The man who came from the ruins of Nazism and helped humanity touch the sky. But the silence still weighs heavy. In 2023, a group of historians proposed adding, alongside Apollo exhibitions, a space dedicated to Mittelbau-Dora's enslaved workers. The proposal sparked controversy. Mixing tragedy with triumph dilutes the heroism, some said. Not talking about it perpetuates forgetting, others replied. The discussion continues, and perhaps it never ends, because what's at stake isn't just one man's memory, but the way we choose to remember ourselves. In Germany, von Braun's name is handled with caution. Universities study him, but rarely celebrate him. The country that once applauded him now analyzes him with historical coolness. He represents the generation of scientists who traded ethics for survival, the textbooks say. But there's also acknowledgement. After all, the same man who helped the Reich create guided weapons opened the doors to the global space age. It's impossible to deny the technical genius. It's equally impossible to forget the human cost. And that's where the story finds its final lesson. Wernher von Braun showed that knowledge by itself has no moral direction. It's fuel. It can lift a civilization or burn it. What defines the course isn't science, but who holds the controls. That's the uncomfortable truth history tries to forget, but that returns with every new technological frontier. With every military drone, every surveillance AI, every weapon made in the name of security, his shadow looms over us. Von Braun was never judged, and perhaps he never could be. The court that would condemn him would also have to condemn all those who chose to look the other way. Generals, politicians, industrialists, even scientists who signed deals in the name of the future. He didn't escape alone. He escaped propped up by a logic that survives to this day, the belief that progress is worth any price. But time has a silent way of collecting its due. Every time a rocket launches, every time a flag is planted in space, there's a question floating among the stars. What did we sacrifice to get here? And no one has the courage to answer it fully. And perhaps that's exactly why stories like this need to be told, without filters, without glamour, without pity. Because they're not just about the past, but about what we can still repeat. Von Braun built rockets, but he also built mirrors, and in looking at him, we see what we're capable of when genius outpaces judgment. If you've made it this far, it's because you believe in the power of real stories, the ones that challenge, that make you think, that show how brilliantly and dangerously human we can be at the same time. So subscribe now and continue with me on this journey through history's shadows and lights, because there are other hidden truths waiting to be told. And remember, space may be infinite, but conscience isn't.